Okay, Rule 18 when it comes to the SAT is to let parallel structure rule. And unfortunately, when I ask students what parallel structure is, many of them have no clue what I might be referring to. So I have to teach what parallel structure is first. I'm going to show some famous examples of parallel structure. And then on top of that, then I'm going to show examples of how this would play out on the SAT. So the definition of parallel structure basically is the strategic construction of sentence into similar patterns, either through verb tense, word choice, word order, punctuation, etc., for rhetorical effect. It usually has some sort of rhythmicity to it, but we'll discuss this separately. So the students that are in this screencastify have already had the opportunity to write this down, so they're not going to write down the definition of parallel structure. That said, example one, please write this down. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. In this famous excerpt from Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail, you see a few different examples of parallel structure. And it starts in the first sentence with word choice of injustice, and then later on in the sentence, justice. You have what are known as paired opposites here. Similarly, then, you have anywhere being juxtaposed with the word everywhere. So, in essence, Dr. King establishes like a sonic effect by doing compare and contrast, by pairing words from the beginning of the sentence with words toward the end of it. So, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, has parallel structure within its bound. Similarly, then, in the next sentence, you'll see that he says, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, pause, tied in a single garment of destiny, stop. Whatever affects one directly, pause, affects all indirectly, stop. At this point, then, those two sentences are parallel to each other because of similar punctuation. There's a stop, or rather a pause in the middle of both sentences that is done for rhetorical effect. And when you read it out loud, you can actually hear that there's a sort of similar rhythm from the first sentence here to the second sentence, whatever. I'm going to also mark up another part of this that stands out is following a similar pattern as the first sentence, inescapable network, single garment are kind of juxtaposed here. The word mutuality then is matched with destiny as being the paired opposite, so to speak. Although in this case, they're more along the lines of a similarity. That also follows through in the very next sentence, though, whatever affects one directly affects all. So one versus all, directly versus indirectly. So there's different layers of parallel structure just in this little excerpt here. One is within each sentence with the use of compare and contrast and paired opposites or similar word choice. And then there's also parallel structure between the second and third sentences because of that pause in the middle. And what it has as a rhetorical effect on the reader is it has a sing-song rhythmic pattern to it that makes it seem logical. A lot of logical arguments are done with these kind of rhetorical and sonic effects in the writing. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. It has a very logical sort of sound to it when it has parallel structure. That brings us to a couple of examples that I don't want students to write down, but you could look them up on the internet. Another great famous example of parallel structure is in William Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar. If you're a sophomore at Northside High School, you're supposed to have read Julius Caesar, and this is Marcus Brutus's speech to the plebeians. I started this, though, where I think the best examples of parallel structure begin. If there be in this assembly any dear friend of Caesar's, to him I say that Brutus's love to Caesar was no less than his. Notice then the second sentence starts with if. If then that friend demand why Brutus rose against Caesar, this is my answer. And that this is where you start to see the juxtaposition of compare and contrast words. Not that I loved Caesar less, but that I loved Rome more. That is parallel structure where you have two paired opposites from the beginning of the sentence versus the end of the sentence. Had you rather Caesar were living and die all slaves, or that Caesar were dead to live all free men? Once again, parallel structure where they have similar word choice, but specifically done to contrast the beginning of one sentence versus the end of that very same sentence. Then what will happen too is that there's a form of parallel structure in which the beginnings of sentences repeat themselves over and over again. As Caesar loved me, I weep for him. As he was fortunate, as he was ambitious, as he was valiant. All of those, as he did this, as he did that. The repetition of beginnings of sentences in a similar structure is another example of parallel structure. So what makes this particularly interesting is that he's using a logical argument. He's like, as Caesar loved me, I weep. As he was fortunate, I rejoiced. As he was valiant, like filled with valor, I honor him. But as he was ambitious, I slew him. And notice that right here at the end, it takes a turn from good, 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 but then Caesar had one bad feature, and therefore I gave him a bad end by slaying him. And then this last part, this list, once again follows the same pattern of parallel structure that we had before. Tears for love, joy for fortune, honor for valor, and death for ambition. And the crazy part, and this is why Shakespeare is the best. I don't care what anybody says, he's the best. This parallel structure here matches the same order of these rhetorical questions that he raised up there, as well as when he started doing the as he was this, as he was that. So that's another famous example of parallel structure. The third famous example of parallel structure comes from the opening chapter of Charles Dickens's, Charles Dickens, not Charles Dickinson, my bad. Charles Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities, a book that I recommend everybody read. Even though it's a tough read, it's one of the most works that you can have. But look, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Notice the compare and contrast. It was the age of wisdom, the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, and it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were going direct to heaven, and we were all going direct the other way. This is the opening paragraph of A Tale of Two Cities. And notice that compare and contrast and conflict is established in the very first paragraph from the start of this wonderful and I would say canonized novel for a very good reason. So one of the questions that you would have to ask if you read this novel was, how are all of these contradictory ideas true? And that's why it's called A Tale of Two Cities. One city is one way and one city is the other. So those are the three famous examples of parallel structure. But then that raises the question is, well, what does it look like on the SAT? And here, because of how long it took for me to describe this, I'm going to have to stop recording and then restart.